right, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. All right, I think we've got the rest of our crew coming in. First, you're going to have Julian Castro, and then after him, Secretary Bob McDonald, respectively the Secretaries of Housing and Urban Development and the Veterans Administration. So thanks a lot for having us. Thanks for being here. I know everybody's come from all around the country, and we're really happy to have the chance to chat and to kind of rack up a little bit of lessons learned about what we've seen in the concerted push from the White House, but across the federal enterprise, led by the First Lady, obviously, and the President, to push to end veterans' homelessness, working directly with, obviously, many of you in the room. And so what I want to do is just have a straight-up conversation, as we were just talking about backstage. And Bob, I'll start with you on kind of what have we learned about veterans' homelessness specifically, causes, what works in addressing, what are long poles in the tent or challenges to addressing this. And then I'll follow up with Julian, and then we'll kind of keep rolling. So please, Bob.
What we know is that the veterans population generally is a disadvantaged population when they enter the military. So we tend to have, as veterans, we tend to have people who have less education, lower income, greater propensity for obesity. And what happens, what creates homelessness can be a number of things. One, it might be an addiction, and so we have to deal with the addiction. Number two, it could be a gap in their military service and them getting their VA benefits, so we're trying to close that gap. Number three, it could be a mental illness that might lead to that homeless condition. Number four, I was in Tampa about 3 weeks ago. I met with 7 veterans, all of whom had full-time jobs, but all of whom were homeless. So imagine you can have a full-time job, but be homeless, because in an urban area you might have rents which are higher than the HUD-VASH voucher amount, which is something Julian and I have worked really hard on. What's worked is the strategy of housing first, getting rid of that lowest level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs to get the person in the house. But it's not housing only, meaning when we get them in the shelter, in the house, then we need to provide the wraparound services that VA provides to deal with the addiction, deal with the mental health issue, deal with getting them a job, deal with reintegrating them into society, and that works, and it works beautifully.
Yeah. So I want to come back at kind of now, you know, we've gotten down to just about 50% reduction. I want to come back to kind of what the big challenges are to get down to zero. But Julian, I guess I want to ask you about the applicability of those findings that Bob just talked about to the larger homelessness challenge. The reason I ask this is I think one of the things that Bob should be really proud of, and I think that the Secretary of the Army, the former Vice Chairman of the, or Vice Chief of the Army, Pete Corelli, should be really proud of, is the things that you guys have done, for example, on TBI or PTSD, end up giving greater applicability across society at large, that we can then apply those findings to other things, to include, by the way, my discussions with my wife about whether my son can play football. Yeah. But tell us, Julian, about applicability of this work to HUD's broader work, but also anything you want to respond to that Bob put on the table here on vets specifically.
Well, first of all, it's great to be with everybody, and my congratulations to the so many communities who are represented here who have done fantastic work and been excellent partners. And you know, Bob and the VA have just been tremendous partners to HUD. I agree with everything that Bob mentioned in terms of the causes and also the approaches. So, you know, the question is, what is the applicability to other types of homelessness? And those of y'all whom here I have had a chance to call and congratulate, you know that one of the things that we've said is, you know, if you've gotten to functional zero on veteran homelessness, don't stop there. You know, tackle youth homelessness, family homelessness, chronic homelessness, so that ultimately we reach the opening doors goal of ending homelessness. I would say one of the biggest lessons from the federal level is that this is an example of Washington working the way that we would hope it would. The resources have been dedicated by Congress. There was an ambitious goal set by the president. There's been strong federal, local, state coordination, public and private collaboration in terms of recruiting landlords and other things. Secondly, leadership matters. It's not an accident that we saw the numbers drive down when the first and second ladies issued the mayor's challenge to end veteran homelessness. I would say third, we do see that things like housing first work, permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing. These are things that have applicability as we tackle chronic homelessness and other types of homelessness. So using those best practices and then trying to move the ball forward and not stopping with veteran homelessness. We recognize that as well in the president's budget. In fiscal year 2017, we proposed a groundbreaking proposal of $11 billion over the next 10 years so that 550,000 families could get vouchers and rapid rehousing, and we could end family homelessness by 2020 utilizing these best practices. So, you know, the chance of that getting funded this year, I think everybody would admit, is not very high. However, it has set a marker and it has taken these lessons learned and I think will bear fruit in the years to come.
Yeah. We've learned a lot through the process, and one of the things we've learned is the importance of working interagency. And I just want to put a plug in for our interagency Council on Homelessness, which Julian and I are involved in. And I want to put that plug in because it's an iterative process. Julian and I were working together in Los Angeles. In 2015 in Los Angeles, we cut veterans homelessness by more than 32%. And it's the #1 location in the country. So we focused on the one location, but it wasn't like we had one set of plans and we went out there. We had to change the HUD-VASH voucher and the way it was done twice. We had to go out and talk to landlords. We had to get people, Julian has put together project-based vouchers so we could literally get with developers to build housing because there wasn't enough low-income housing. But that ability to work interagency is so critical. One of the things we're telling Congress is we need them to fund the continuation of the Interagency Council because it becomes, in a sense, more difficult because VA does so much for veterans. Well, now we need education, labor, Health and Human Services working together for the non-veteran population for what VA can do for veterans.
Yeah.
And I would just echo that. I believe one of the lasting legacies of President Obama and this and the place-based work that we've done is just breaking down the silos and interacting with communities, whether it's on ending veteran homelessness or improving the educational achievement of a community or improving housing. There's been tremendous progress that I think also is a lesson learned of how we ought to do business that I hope sticks. So
to get from, you know, we have the reduction we have, to get to functional zero across the country, what's the long pole in the tent? Just more of what we're doing? Or is there some missing ingredient that makes it harder in some communities? Is there something that we've not yet succeeded in executing as against these lessons learned that you've just discussed?
For veterans, Dennis, we literally have the names of the individuals, and we're at that point where it's less than 40,000. So we literally have the names, but one of the things we're doing to bend the curve even further, because in the last year, 2015, we had a 17% reduction in veteran homelessness. That's 4 times the rate of the previous year. Part of it was I think Julian and I would both clap for everyone here and not for ourselves because you all are the ones who did that, not us.
Amen.
We just may be fortunate enough to be able to help a little bit, but a 17% reduction. But we also have found there are things we can do to improve. For example, The federal database doesn't talk to the local database, can't talk to the local base. So we've made it an IT priority that we've got to create that capability to talk, because now that we're down by names, we want to make sure we can share those names and share information on those individuals across.
Is that strictly a technical challenge, or are there privacy concerns on that, or what?
Both.
Okay.
Both, but mostly the technical challenge. Yeah. Secondarily, cities, locations where the rental amount is higher than the HUD-VASH voucher amount. We work on that. And then we also try to find, we have a developer in Los Angeles, for example, who bought a bankrupt hotel and is going to turn that bankrupt hotel into residences for veterans. But he's doing that based on project-based HUD-VASH vouchers. So knowing how many project-based vouchers we need becomes critical. Then Julian and I work together to create those. Another one that we had was Native Americans who were homeless. Native Americans tend to serve more in the military than non-Native Americans, but they also become homeless. But they may not want to go into housing or a shelter off of the Native American reservations. So Julian made a big change, the first time ever that I know about, where we can use the HUD-VASH voucher amount on the reservation. So as we find problems, we change the way we do business in order to get that number down.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly, those are exactly some of the steps that we need to take. I would say that the fundamental question for Congress will be a question of resources. I mean, with SSVF, with HUD-VASH, we have had the resources to effectively drive down the numbers on veteran homelessness. The question is, will those resources be there when it comes to family homelessness, youth homelessness, chronic homelessness? The other question for us in terms of enhancing our collaboration is that at the beginning of this, and I want to give a shout out to Matthew Doherty and the USICH, we were not measuring homeless veterans or counting homeless veterans in the same way. We were not talking to each other the way we do today, working out problems in the way that we do today. Some of those challenges, frankly, still remain when it comes to youth homelessness, for instance. There's this issue of how does the Department of Education count? How does HUD count? And we are beginning to work through those, but that work has to continue. And this is where I think the mayors in this room and the local leaders can be great ambassadors. Even on veteran homelessness, the fact is that not everybody is as focused on it as y'all have been. Not everybody is, I want to give a shout out to Mayor Landrieu, because he was the first one, I think, to accomplish this. Yeah, he deserves a round of applause. But, as a former mayor myself, I know that if you set a priority, then the folks in your organization are going to work to make it happen. Not all of the mayors out there have made it as high a priority. That's why you can be ambassadors to make sure that that does happen. And be ambassadors on these other types of homelessness as well, to make sure that that's a priority in your city and in other cities.
Let me just, I'll add the kudos to the USICH. When I did the point-in-time count 2 years ago in San Francisco, and then earlier this year in Philadelphia, I was really proud of not only were each of the mayors terrific, but it was good to see that the USICH rep in each city was a catalyst for action. That's partly because that rep also had resources. This goes to the point about Congress. But so let me endorse that. Let me ask, and maybe the crowd will have a different answer to this, but why don't you guys give us your answer? Maybe Julian, you've seen both ends of this. Bob and you both talked about interagency collaboration in the federal enterprise. Talk about federal to state to local collaboration. What are the long poles in that?
Yeah, can I go first on that one? Because you mentioned San Francisco, and it just reminded me of when I was in San Francisco with Mayor Lee, and we were working on the fact that it costs so much to rent a place in San Francisco.
That's their big challenge, right?
Mayor Lee called together all the Chinese American landlords and said, this is your patriotic responsibility to use the HUD-VASH vouchers for veterans. That made a huge difference. And my point in saying that is to your question, which is we can't solve every problem from Washington, D.C. with a 3,000-mile screwdriver. You know, and as we get these numbers lower and lower, what we discover is it's different issues in different locations that require a different response. And while SSVF, Supportive Services for Veteran Families, is inherently flexible, being creative and flexible in applying the right solution in the right locale becomes very, very important.
And do you find that the federal system works well enough and flexibly enough, Bob, that you can, it's not a one-size-fits-all?
I'm very thankful for the creativity of the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development.
Well, and I would say that I think we've gotten a lot better over the years, and I hope folks have seen that. And that goes for our relationship with state governments. Just like with community, with localities, it's a mixed bag when it comes to whether states have prioritized ending veteran homelessness or ending homelessness in general. We're very happy that there are 3 states that have effectively ended veteran homelessness: Virginia, and then Connecticut, and just last week, Delaware. Yeah. And so they're showing that it can be done. And the only thing that I would add to that is that especially when you have these states that have within them cities that are seeing very high spikes in rent and are very tight rental markets, like San Francisco or a number of other communities, I think we've gotten better about using project-based HUD-VASH vouchers. So just today, for instance, we're allocating $18 million worth of project-based HUD-VASH vouchers, 2,000 of those. And you know, it means that we have to be creative, we have to be flexible and understand what the challenges are. We're working on how we do fair market rents at HUD. So that we can tackle more broadly the ability of somebody with a voucher to actually get into housing.
Dennis, I would just add to that when I was in Tampa, I met with several banks who help us fund the development of this residential construction. And being formerly a private sector business guy, we were talking about the rates of return. I don't want to have anybody in the audience, any mayor or nonprofit organization, think that the rates of return for these developers are low. They're not. They're quite good. And these banks and these lenders would like to do more of this business. So if you're in a community where you're having trouble finding a financier, let me know, bob.mcdonald@va.gov, and we'll connect you with the people who want to do it. But they're good rates of return.
That's good. That's transparency right there. You know, when you think about, at least what I've heard just in my conversations, people a lot of times will say, you know, there's a homeless problem in some cases because somebody prefers to be homeless, right? Tell me about that, about what does our data set suggest since the onset of this? People getting access. What happens then? I assume our work's not done, obviously, but what are we doing to make sure that people get the continued service and access to some of the challenges, to address some of the challenges that create the problem in the first instance? No. 1, and 2, just what does the data tell us, right? And this, I guess, goes to the broader applicability about solutions sticking for individuals.
I've talked to a lot of homeless veterans or prior I've never met anybody who wanted to be homeless. And what's really critical beyond the housing first strategy and getting them into a residence that the HUD-VASH voucher can manage, and getting the SSVF support for the furniture and so forth, is we've got to have a VA caseworker with a personal relationship with that individual, making sure that we understand what is the cause, what is the issue, connected with the medical center. I see Dr. David Shulkin is here, the Undersecretary for Health for the VA. We've got to have a connection with the medical center, and we've got to make sure they get those wraparound services that they need and deserve. And then we've got to make sure that their treatment follows a stepwise fashion, and in many cases we get them the education benefits that they've already earned. I remember meeting in Tucson a young man who had lived in the desert and didn't want to come in out of the desert. Make a long story short, he came in out of the desert. He got a bachelor's degree with a GI Bill, got a master's degree with GI Bill. I think he's en route to a doctorate, and he's now working for the VA, bringing other veterans in out of the desert. And these
awesome.
Stories are so inspiring.
It's pretty awesome.
The benefit package is there. We need the caseworker to help connect the homeless person, the prior homeless person, with the benefits that are available.
Good.
Yeah, I think the data do show that those supportive services are absolutely crucial in order to retain folks in housing. Secondly, that housing first works, both in terms of saving money in the long run and ensuring that folks stay housed, or they're more likely to stay housed. One of the other lessons that we've learned is that the work of so many nonprofits out there makes a huge difference. And we have some that are represented here, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, National League of Cities, a number of others that I'm sure I'm skipping over, and I apologize right now. But those national and local nonprofits that make such a difference, because fundamentally what we see is that when there is personal engagement, that sometimes you overcome some of the reservations that someone on the street may have about accepting help. That is not always a natural thing. You know, and I think that that in fact the caseworker model and nonprofits that have folks who are on the ground who are doing that kind of work, that they're essential to being able to get folks to avail themselves of the help.
I would just, if I can just add that prior to Veterans Day, we kicked off at the VA something called Operation Reveille, where basically it's I call it a stand down on steroids. We have stand downs where in our medical centers where we bring veterans in off the street. We do everything from giving them a haircut, a shower, a medical exam. At the end of the pipe now with Operation Reveille, we will put them in housing and get that caseworker established. So by the time we get them into the system, by the time they exit it, they're in housing, they have a caseworker, and things are moving along. We have about 25 cities so far who have signed up for Operation Reveille, but if you're the mayor of a city or you're in a nonprofit in a city and you'd like to sign up for Operation Reveille, we've said we're going to do it over the next 90 days, next 120 days, because we want to make a change. I've challenged a team that with a 17% reduction in 2015, I want to do better than that in 2016, and the point in time count is a few months away. So just email david.shulkin@va.gov or talk to him at the reception, or me, and David and I will get you connected to Operation Reveille and make sure, the challenge is to make sure we have the resources in that city to get it done. But yeah, it's now about less than 40,000 people. We have a list of names, so we're really eager to get this done.
And I guess that's a point I'm trying to draw out, Bob, which is to say we got the names, and one could look at what you've both just talked about, which is basically a tapestry of services for individuals, and that could be at one level quite daunting to think that, you know, basically getting somebody under a roof is in some ways just the start. But I guess what I hear both of you saying is that there's as Julian has just talked through, a range of partners to include NGOs, nonprofits, and other community partners. But you're also saying that you have pots of money, Bob, that you guys are drawing on to make sure that that tapestry of services kind of runs through.
Yeah, and I also, you raised an excellent point, and Julian did as well. When we put up our My VA transformation program to transform the VA, one of the things we called out as one of our 5 strategies is creating strategic partnerships. There's 2 reasons for that. One is they're a force multiplier. So all of our SSVF partners are force multipliers for us to better care for homeless veterans. But also there's an ethical issue. The ethical issue for me is very simple. Some of my brothers and sisters, when they left the military, unlike me, got dishonorable discharges. By law, we are unable to serve those with dishonorable discharges. And there are different gradations of less than honorable, but let's just stick with dishonorable. So we need those strategic partners to care for them. So for example, in Boston, Home Base, which is funded by the Boston Red Sox Foundation, they're one of our partners for mental health care in Boston. They can treat families, they can treat veterans who have dishonorable discharges, so we can then hand off the veteran who comes to us and may have bad paper that we can't help them.
Julian, is it obvious if you're sitting on, as you know, Senator Landrieu or many of the other, Mayor Landrieu or many of the other mayors in the room, they've done this, but is it obvious kind of how you piece this tapestry together? Or what's the best way if either people in the room or people watching are saying to themselves, all right, I want to do my share on the 40,000. Do I need like a team of 25 people to do this? Or is there a kind of is this template of it, understandably flexible template available for people so they can kind of dig into this?
No, it absolutely is, especially now that there are so many cities, I think 31 localities that have actually done it. And so, you know, they can go to the HUD website or look up the Mayor's Challenge to End Veteran Homelessness. There are nonprofits like 0 to 16 and this 25 Cities Initiative that are doing great work. So there are different entry points where that blueprint can be provided. I do think that oftentimes there is a gap between, you know, at the federal level, what goals are set, and then at the local level, you know, who actually hears it. You can have mayors out there that if they knew more about it, they would tackle it with a vengeance, but it just doesn't filter down for some reason. That's why the National League of Cities, the Conference of Mayors, our nonprofits that work with so many different communities across the United States, you know, are so important. I also want to give a shout out to Jerry Abramson and his group here, because I know they have made sure that so many cities know about it. But you know, the website, these nonprofit groups, HUD, there are different entry points that cities can use to get that blueprint.
Can either of you talk through kind of how this plays out on the Hill? I guess I could see that there may be some question or, you know, some concern about what's the future of this effort. So how should people be thinking about that? That is to say, sounds like good lessons learned, sounds like it works. We've got the data to prove that it works. It's not even a huge lift as it relates to resources. But what about the durability now, or the stickiness of the priority going forward? Are there champions on the Hill? Are there particular challenges on the Hill? How should our partners think about that?
One of the things that we do, Dennis, when we go to the Hill and talk this, David and I and others, is we talk about the total system. You know, how do you set up a system so that even the person who may fall back at risk into homelessness, you know, the system will catch them and put them, because really what we want to do is develop a systemic solution. The second thing we talk about is the rate of return. The rate of return on keeping someone from becoming homeless is not arguable. I mean, I've looked at, I think, 29 different pieces of research that have shown that keeping someone from becoming homeless has rates of return that are astronomical. And the reason for that is because the veteran who's sleeping on the street is always in your emergency room. And they're always showing up in your emergency room, and they're always suffering from chronic issues that are because they're on the street. So if you can get them in somewhere, get them the care they need, the rate of returns are astounding.
And those arguments win the day on the Hill generally that you're finding?
So far.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's there is a strong track record of Congress funding HUD-VASH and related investments. I'm confident that in the years to come, there will be resources that are allocated by Congress to continue to drive down the number of homeless veterans. There are two open questions, though. Number one is that there needs to be reauthorization of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. And that's coming up in, what, a year and a half or 2 years? I'm sure Matthew can correct me on the exact date, but in the appropriations cycle this time, I think that on the Senate side, they extended it by 1 year, And on the House side, there was no language of extension. And so that's an urgent matter because USICH has been the instrument to coordinate all of these federal efforts. They have been vital, and without USICH's leadership, we would not have a 47% decline in veteran
And it's
homelessness.
more urgent now because it's no longer will VA be, I mean, VA's for veterans. VA's done that work for veterans. Now we need the interagency council to help us with the rest of the population.
No, that's true.
So it's actually more urgent now than ever before.
And then just the second thing I would say is again, this issue of we know the lessons learned, we know the policy approaches that work, a lot of the partnerships are there. Will the resources be there for tackling family homelessness and youth homelessness and chronic homelessness?
Yeah.
My hope is that folks will continue to be good ambassadors for showing what's possible, and that the stories of success that we've seen here will help in the future.
Dennis, you mentioned since 2010, we've cut veterans' homelessness virtually in half, 47%. I like to look at the reverse number, which since 2010, we have housed 480,000 veterans, family members, or rehoused or kept from becoming homeless.
Right.
500,000 people.
That's right. No, it's yeah, I mean, the you can never disprove the negative, right? But that's the unrung bells here are pretty significant. Yeah. So I'm going to go a little bit off script, unless the colonel or teen or somebody shoots me like a death stare. We have a bunch of people in the room, right, who have done this. I think this will stretch a little bit. So I'd be interested to hear if there's particular questions, lessons learned, observations from anybody about things that we've not hit that come out of your conversations you've been having today or the experience that you're having across the country to address this. And I'll just respond to, I'll just bring a mic to anybody who wants to be heard on this. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Charlie Hales, Mayor of Portland. And again, this partnership has been so productive and so helpful to all of us. One thing we talked about in our breakout group that I want to emphasize, and there were some questions in our breakout group about what can the private sector do? Obviously, a lot of us have had a lot of good luck with landlords and property managers stepping up, and as Mayor Lee did. And that's great, and we're going to continue to need that. But the employment piece, I think, is really important, and that's something the private sector can really do for us, is be part of that local workforce development council, partner that up with whatever kind of consortium we have at the local level on homelessness. And for those vets that are ready to get back into work, as well as other homeless people, that's really critical. And I've got our nonprofit partner here, Transition Projects from Portland, and they do that, and you see those stories of people getting their first home, beating their addiction, getting their first job, the pride in their voice, and you know the path that they're on for the rest of their life, and that you've actually done the job in their case, and that's glorious.
I agree with that. In fact, if you want to learn how to hire more vets, or you want to know where to go, just go to vets.gov, and it's on our website. But I couldn't agree with that comment more. Getting the person into a job and in a stable situation is so critical, and it's critical. I'm thinking now of a gentleman I met in Boston where he had kicked his addiction, where he had gotten into a residence where he had a job, and he said to me, the most important thing is, for the first time, my mother is proud of me again. And he also said, my children are proud of me. People don't want to be in these situations. And that means so much to them. And I couldn't agree with the comment more. If you need help connecting with jobs, please let us know, because right now employers are calling us saying we can't find the vets to hire. Veteran unemployment is below 5%. It's been at record lows, and employers are having trouble finding the vets to hire, but we're playing matchmaker.
That's great. Well, look, I want to shout out Tina and obviously the First Lady and the whole Joining Forces team on this, because I think this is the whole idea, right?
Right.
Is to make sure that that full panoply of service, from recognizing the applicability of the skills developed in the services, making sure education opportunities over and above that are available. Employment opportunities are there once each of those experiences are fulfilled, and then if people are falling through the cracks, we have the support to make sure that people get a lift up. It's kind of the whole story of Joining Forces. So I could not be more proud of Tina's work, and obviously everybody on the Joining Forces team. Other questions or observations? We're down to 5 minutes left here, so.
Good afternoon, Nancy Backus. I'm the mayor of Auburn, Washington. One of the things that we struggle with is there are so many different definitions of homelessness that it's difficult to get those services, the wraparound services, because what qualifies you to be homeless in one portion of the government doesn't qualify you to be homeless in the other, and so it's very difficult to get those services to those in need.
Yeah, let me take a crack at that to say that I think with regard to veterans that we've come a long, long way there to synchronize definitions and work together to avoid those kinds of difficulties. We still have some work to do, and I know my team works very hard, and folks do across the administration to make sure that it is as seamless as possible, but there is no question that there is still some work to do. In those instances, working closely with our offices, if you're a community out there that's having a challenge with that, helps, because often we can be helpful. Sometimes, frankly, we have found that communities think you can't do something or think some folks may not be qualified when they actually are. Sometimes there legitimately are issues and things that we need to work through. So it's a point very, very well taken.
I wonder if this is something we can just give to the Interagency Council on Homelessness to just address in the next 2 months, not to resolve the issue, but if Julian is right and you're right, there's got to be some kind of some
you're
kind
right.
of yeah. At least baseline setting that we can make, so as to if it's true that people. Maybe there's more flexibility than people are led to believe. Query whether we can at least memorialize that in the next 67 days. Yeah, please. This will be the last one, and Colonel, you might have to come up here and give us the next marching orders.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And just for the record, I'm Evan Slogenhop. I'm president of the Calvert County, Maryland Board of County Commissioners, but I also chair the Veterans Regional Advisory Committee for Southern Maryland. And just want to make a comment, and that is that while we're all concerned about homelessness, that's only a part of it. There are so many other issues that have to be addressed at the same time. Transportation, if someone's homeless, they also have transportation issues. Access to health care, huge problem, and particularly in Southern Maryland right now, as well as education for the veterans. So I understand the good works about homelessness. Don't treat it as just a single issue here. Do it comprehensively. Thank you.
If I can
Fair
add,
enough, Bob, please.
Thank you for bringing that up, Evan, because one of the things we did under our MyVA transformation is we're in the process of setting up community veteran engagement boards around the country. Right now we're at about 85. I want to be at 100 by the end of the year, and I'd like to keep going. But the idea is to have a board, as kind of Evan was describing, where you've got community leaders around the table. The VA people are there too. We have the VA people from healthcare, from cemeteries. Hopefully you won't need that immediately. Cemeteries and benefits. And they can work together to customize the offerings of the VA for that community and deal with issues like this. I'll give you an example. San Bernardino, we had a real issue on the transportation of veterans. And one of the things the county commissioners decided to do in San Bernardino was provide free public transportation for all veterans. And so those kinds of local solutions,
Were you able to give them some funding support for that?
They didn't
If
want
Calvert
it.
County was going to do something like that?
they didn't want it.
They didn't, but would you have the wherewithal if Calvert County wanted
I
to do
would have to figure it out.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, but sure. But the solutions need to be local.
Yeah.
And there was nobody, there was no, there wasn't a consistent community-based organization, and now we have that, which is helping us customize what we do. If you're in a community and you don't have a community veteran engagement board and you'd like one, just email me, bob.mcdonald@va.gov, and I will make sure we get going on one.
Good. Okay, well, I'm going to invite the Colonel up here to give us our next assignments. While he's coming up, let me just say thanks to everybody for coming in.